Hi everybody, it's me, the Fetch, host of Inside the Eye Live. Before the Sunday mainstream media political pundit talk shows, there is Inside the Eye Live, where we break down some of the weekly mainstream media talking points before the talking points even get aired. Add in some entertaining stories, weather, cats, intriguing and informative guests, and you get one of the most listened to Saturday morning streaming media political talk shows going today. And it's all right here on our flagship station, Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. So join me, the Fetch, for Inside the Eye Live every Saturday morning at 10 o'clock a.m. Eastern. It is truly intelligent media for the politically aware.
Welcome to Sacred Matrix, a divine paradigm of love and universal consciousness, with your host, Janet Kira Lessin and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Together we transform the world.
And now, here are your hosts, Janet Kira and Dr. Sasha Lessin.
Dr. Sasha Lessin, and today we interview author guest Laird-Scranton. And he is the author of a series of books and other writings on ancient cosmology and language. These include articles published in the University of Chicago's Anthropology News Academic Journal, Temple University's Encyclopedia of African Religion, and the Encyclopedia Britainnica. He is featured in John Anthony West's Magical Egypt documentary series, and in Carmen Boulter's documentary, The Pyramid Code. He is a frequent guest on a wide range of radio and podcast interviews shows, including Red Ice Radio in Europe, Art Bell's Desert at Midnight, and Coast to Coast Radio with George Noory. He is also a frequent presenter at conferences whose focus is on ancient knowledge. These include Walter Cruttenden's conference on Precession and Ancient Knowledge, CPAK, and the A.R.E.'s Ancient Mysteries Conference, Scotty Roberts and John Ward's Paradigm Symposium, the Fringe New Jersey Conference, and James Swagger's Megalithic Odyssey Conference in Marlborough, England. His books include The Science of the Dogon, Sacred Symbols of the Dogon, The Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol, the Velikovsky Heresies, China's Cosmology Prehistory, Point of Origin, The Mystery of Skara-Brae, which is due in December 2016, and he's also featured in two books called Forbidden Science and Lost Secrets of the Gods. And he helped co-author Ed Nightingale's The Giza Template. Hey, we're looking forward to the show. Dr. Lessin, what would you like to say before we bring on Laird?
Well, I'm pretty excited to have an Egyptologist on the show, have you on the show, Laird. Sitchin has said basically that Egyptian civilization was the result of the visit of King Anu of Nibiru in 3850 BCE, where some of the Sumerian leaders, particularly Enki or Ptah in Egypt, who helped to reclaim the area and then gave his rule to Marduk, Ra, and Geb and Nut and so forth down to Seth and Osiris. And I just wonder what your take as an academic is on this version that Sitchin has.
So we will get into that in a few moments. Laird-Scranton, welcome to our show.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
We're delighted to have you. I know you were recommended to me by somebody because of a conference, and now it's been a while, and I can't remember how you came to be with us, but we're delighted you're here.
Well, I'm very glad to be here.
So where would you like to begin? We'll get into Dr. Lessin's question, a little bit more about who you are, how you got into the work, just fill in some of the blanks for us, and what direction your work is going now.
Okay, I was Professionally, I was a software designer. I designed software systems, custom software systems for businesses. And in the middle of the 1990s, I happened across an article about this African tribe, a modern-day African tribe called the Dogon, who have cultural connections and religious connections to ancient traditions. And I started exploring and learning about them, and was keeping notes for myself about very interesting things I was learning about them, and ended up having enough material to self-publish a book. And that book was, it caught the attention of John Anthony West, the Egyptologist who has studied the Sphinx, and he was instrumental in getting the book published. And he wrote the foreword for the first couple of books, and he's become a good friend. And since that time, I've written a number of books. I've sort of pursued the field of, it's called comparative cosmology. The idea is that we're studying myths and symbols and religious ritual practices of various groups, and trying to learn more about those by comparing what various cultures understand about the same symbol or the same myth. So my work has sort of progressed from Africa with the Dogon tribe. They're located in Mali, which is in the northern hump of Africa, to Egypt, to India, to Tibet and China, then to ancient Turkey. And the latest book that will be out in the next few months is the focus is on northern Scotland, a little village in northern Scotland from around 3200 BC called Scarborough. So the basic idea is that by comparing these symbols and words and so forth, these practices, the essence is that many of the ancient cultures have the same, well, as Carl Jung and people like that have noticed, there are archetypical symbols and themes and practices. And so what I have been trying to do is, through these comparisons, get to the bottom of some of it, to try to understand what do these cultures themselves say about their own traditions, and how much can we cross-verify those things, developing special ways of cross-verifying. For example, the Dogon system of their creation tradition is given using words that are arguably ancient Egyptian words. And so the Dogon tell us that a particular word has a particular meaning, or a particular symbol has a particular meaning. We can go to ancient Egypt, we can go to an Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and verify what the Dogon are saying. A large part of the books that I have been writing involve comparison of words between cultures, demonstrating how certain words are understood the same way. Even as far distant as ancient China, there are commonalities with Egyptian hieroglyphic language and things like that.
One question I would have from the get-go is, whereas we tend to write off statements of other cultures, even high-achieving cultures, as myths, many people make the question, maybe these are merely descriptions in the metaphors available to people of what they actually observed, rather than being primitive fantasies or myths.
Yes, that's true. And one of the difficulties is trying to distinguish what is a mythical statement from what is a factual statement. Mm-hmm. One of the ways of doing that is by entertaining the possibility that it might be factual and seeing where that takes us. Mm-hmm. For example, the African tribe, the Dogon tribe, say that their symbols describe how a tribal god created matter. Mm-hmm. And we might take that as being just a metaphoric statement, but the fact is they have descriptions of atoms and of components of atoms like electrons and protons and neutrons, correct descriptions, and even a correct drawing of an electron orbit. It looks like they knew what they were talking about when it comes to those things. Mm. And there's a very detailed descending structure from there that they describe that I didn't have enough knowledge when I started out to be able to evaluate. But the more I learned about it, the more I realized that you can set it side by side with scientific descriptions and diagrams, and it's all the correct stuff. It's all the reasonable descriptions of how matter actually forms.
How did they say they got this information?
Now, the Dogon say they learned it from somebody who knew more about these things than we do in ancient times. They say that certain civilizing skills of their culture, they were instructed skills. They were taught how to plow a field and how to plant seeds and how to harvest crops. And that there was an instructed civilizing plan that was sort of tagged to these concepts of creation in a mnemonic way, so that the way they wove a cloth had symbolism to it, and the way they plow a field has symbolism to it, and the symbolism reinforces these scientific concepts.
What did they say?
No, go ahead. The idea was that when a Dogon tribes person would step out of their hut, that the things that they would see in their everyday life and the actions that they would take in their everyday life would reinforce this instructed system.
What did they say about the agent or the being that gave them this instruction? Was it a person? What did they say about that?
It's controversial what they have to say, and basically, let's do some comparison. The Dogon system, symbolic system, is a match for a Buddhist system. Both symbolic systems go along with a type of aligned shrine. In Buddhism, it's a stupa. For the Dogon, it's called a granary, but it's essentially the same form. And the Buddhists flatly say that their most sacred symbols were instructed to them by from a non-human source, that they received it from a non-human source. Just as the Egyptians say they got their written language from gods, the Buddhists are saying, look, we were taught this by somebody who wasn't human. Now, the Dogon agree with that. The Dogon say that it was a non-human source, but they actually take it another step further. They say not only was it non-human, but originally it was non-material. That even though it was there were actions taken that were physical actions in our real world, that the original source of this came from a non-material place.
So, are they saying it was spiritual? It was
no more. It's more than that. One of the things the Dogon described, they say that if you're familiar with stories of Moses with the Israelites, when God appears to Moses on the mountain, there are effects that happen that the Israelites are very sternly warned to stay back from. These are not healthy effects. You don't want to come too close to this. Well, the Dogon essentially say the same thing, which is that their teachers were concerned about what possible bad effects there might be on us from being around them. And so their solution to that was to sequester a group of 8 tribespeople in a remote location, teach those 8, and send them back to teach everybody else. And that sort of put a limit on how much bad interaction might happen between us and them.
What did they say happened to these 8 people? Were they sickened by radioactivity or what?
No, as it turns out, they weren't. Really all over the world, you have mythic stories of the 8 mythic ancestors who come to teach civilizing skills. The Dogon have the same essential stories, but no reports of bad effects really on the ancestors who did the teaching.
So they didn't. So they were somehow protected from these negative effects, but they were warned by these beings that they might get them. Is that what you're saying?
Right, and I don't have information on how they managed to protect those 8 from these possible bad effects. In the Bible stories, the protection comes by keeping a distance from the godlike.
Well, we have the Ark of the Covenant that apparently had some highly radioactive material, and they kept it in this case that was protected, that helped protect those who were.
Right. Now, the Dogon had the presence of mind to ask their teachers if they were God. And the teachers said, no, we're not God, but if it helps you to think that way, you can consider us to be agents of God. But they actually denied that yes, they knew more than we did, but they weren't trying to present themselves as being gods. In fact, where the ancient Egyptians see gods as having done certain things. In the Dogon system, those same creative aspects are described as stages of a scientific process. It's hard to explain. The Dogon, let's say, process by which waves start to become particles is represented by a deity in Egypt. This is the god Keper, who represents the concept of non-existence coming into existence. It's as if at some stage of the process, what began as scientific concepts were personified, maybe as a way to make it easier to remember them, maybe as a mnemonic device. But from the Dogon standpoint, there's really no stage of this that really rises to the level of a deity the same way that it does in Egypt.
Were they able to convert this knowledge into technological devices, or did they do something like that?
No, they don't have a technological society, although they do have technological knowledge about things. This is one of the things that brought the Dogon to the attention of modern society in the first place, was that they knew some facts about astronomy that they really shouldn't know without access to telescopes. They knew that there was more than one star in the Sirius system, even though the second star that's in a binary relationship with the sun-like star can't be seen without a telescope. It's even hard to see it with a telescope because the bright star is so bright, and the smaller dark star is constantly in the bright glare of the bigger star. But they knew not only that the second star was there, they also knew the correct orbital period for the two stars, and they based some of their festivals and things on this orbital period. That's really just the tip of the iceberg of what they knew scientifically.
How did they think that they came to exist? I mean, what was the origin of humanity from their perspective?
They don't really deal with that question except as regards processes of creation. If we're talking about biological reproduction, they have a very clear sense of how biological reproduction happens, but they don't carry that to a level where they say, and the Dogon tribe was created by so-and-so. They're not talking about humanity being created from clay or, women being created from the rib of a man or things like that. They have a much more scientific view of this, and their concept of ancestors goes back farther than their memory actually goes. They don't have a written language and they don't have written text. So they don't try to deal with that as a religious question.
Did they believe in God or gods?
They have one character, mythological character, who's treated as a deity. Name is Amma, and Amma is a counterpart in a lot of ways to Amen in Egypt. In fact, in languages of North African tribes, Amma and Amen are equivalent terms. They both represent a hidden god, and the names also carry additional meanings that are a match. There are common icons between the two gods. They hold similar positions in relationship to other mythological characters, and they are credited with performing similar actions. So it's pretty easy to correlate the two.
Fascinating.
From the Dogon standpoint, when you get down to the details of his system, you realize that even Amma is a metaphor for a set of scientific processes. So when you get down to the bottom of it, I would say they don't really celebrate a deity. They don't even use the word worship. They use the word celebrate or praise. Where later cultures or later religions like Christianity see good versus evil, the Dogons see truth versus error, a very non-judgmental system. Wow. But if you don't have a concept of good and evil, then you can't very well have concepts of things like heaven and hell or punishment after death or any of the trappings that we associate with some of the modern religions. So
when did those things emerge?
At a later point in time. The system I'm talking about, it looks like, had its beginnings, the farthest back we can trace them is to the end of the last ice age, which is about 12,000 years ago. After that, the ice age becomes sort of a block to any positive evidence that we can point to. The traditions like the stories of Moses and the Exodus from Egypt are more traditionally assigned to eras like around 1500 BC. So maybe, 8,000 years after the philosophies that underlie the Dogon tradition were first apparent.
Great. So then you went from the Dogon, and then you proceeded to where did your research go next?
Well, starting with the Dogon. Okay, the Dogon were a good starting point because they have ritual practices a lot like Judaism. They wear skull caps and they wear prayer shawls. They circumcise and they celebrate a Jubilee year like Judaism does. But the words of the tradition, the words and the symbols, are Egyptian words and symbols. And the symbolic system is a match for Buddhism. So you have three different sets of influences in one setting here. The Buddhist influences, interestingly enough, are given in an entirely different language. They're in Sanskrit. And so even though you can correlate sets of concepts and sets of symbols and symbolic ideas and ritual definitions between the Buddhist and the Dogon, you can't directly correlate a lot of the words. That's one of the things that allows me to verify certain things. I know that the Buddhist system was documented by about 400 BC in its current form, and the Dogon system is given in words that went out of use by around 750 BC, Egyptian words. So we know that these are both very ancient traditions, but modern texts, modern authorities on Buddhism describe a system that's a match for what modern Dogon priests say their system represents. So that implies that both of these cultures, who have their traditions in different languages, so it doesn't look like one got it from the other, they managed to keep all the details of their system straight for thousands of years so that they still match today. If they hadn't, they wouldn't still match. So when you have both cultures telling us they got it from a non-human source, that puts a researcher like me in a difficult spot, because I could propose that they each managed to keep all of these other details straight, but both forgot where they got it from, or both misremembered where they got it from, and somehow misremembered it in the same way. Or I can say they kept all of the details straight, including who they got it from, in which case I have to allow that there was a non-human involvement.
So when you talk about non-human, did they look like a different species? They weren't a human that might be from advanced race coming to a more primitive race, or were they not looking like human beings?
That's a good question, and this is one of the areas where it becomes difficult to separate what might be a metaphoric description as opposed to an actual physical one. But there are connections to Egyptian symbols and Egyptian drawings and Egyptian words, and from the Dogon words that apply to their teachers relate to Egyptian words that apply to Pygmies. And so it looks as if, all over the world we have reports in ancient times of short-statured people who were considered to be sorcerers. This is true in Scotland, it's true in Africa, it's true in Polynesia, it's true even in North America, places like that. So the suggestion is that we might have been talking about a group of teachers, in this case, who were short-statured, who we consider to be Pygmies. It's also possible that there was involvement with more than one type of group.
Were they possibly like the gray aliens that we have in modern times?
Possibly could be. The Egyptian glyphs that represent these Pygmies don't look like gray aliens, but there's no reason to think there might not be a connection. I just don't have a way of demonstrating that to be true.
So the glyphs, the Egyptian glyphs, what do they look like? What distinguishes them from just short human beings?
What mostly distinguishes them from humans is in cases where cultures are describing these Pygmies, they're described as being of very strange habits and having capabilities that appear magical to the humans who are writing the narratives. When the Scandinavians first got to northern Scotland, they reported two groups side by side, one that sounds a lot like the African Dogon priests, and the other that sounds an awful lot like their teachers, these Pygmies.
So what kind of abilities did they have?
That's also hard to get a clear fix on, but we have multiple reports that they were described as sorcerers, so it was something that, in some cultures there are descriptions of ability to shapeshift or ability to levitate objects or ability to materialize things out of thin air. But again, that without confirmed written text to be able to anchor these things to, it's hard to separate what was somebody's fantasy from what actually happened.
Or what was the technological event that they didn't comprehend, too.
Right.
Right. Now, anybody who correctly understands how matter forms and can correctly describe the process from waves to atoms obviously is a pretty capable person.
Yeah.
So it's easy to imagine that they had the ability to do things that we don't associate normally with ancient cultures. So the ability to travel, at least regionally, if not globally. Abilities to keep time and all the normal, usual things you would expect of somebody who had technological knowledge.
Are they describing perhaps like a form of teleportation?
There are stories from ancient times of people being able to teleport something or being able to levitate something, things like that. But again, as I said, the difficulty from a researcher's standpoint like mine is how do you distinguish between a mythical story that somebody wrote or even a fable that somebody wrote as opposed to an actual historical account. It's very hard to pin that down in a firm way.
Well, that's what they're going to have trouble with 1,000 years from now. They're going to sorting out what's science fiction and science fact when they look back at these times in our writings.
When you get things like there's a binary or a star that exists that you can't see with the naked eye, that seems to imply some kind of someone had information. It implies that the information had to be gotten by observation of some sort.
Right, or that clearly whoever was the original source of this knowledge was, as I said, was pretty capable. One thing the Dogon information leads us to is, let's see, how do I explain this properly? When the Dogon describe how matter forms, or when they're talking about processes of creation, they're talking about three themes in parallel with each other. They're talking about how the universe forms, how matter forms, and how biological reproduction happens. And they see these as being parallel processes. And so to demonstrate that parallelism of those processes, they describe all three simultaneously using a single progression of symbols. And so when they're talking about how matter forms, the essential component of matter, the structure that exists at every point in space-time, according to the Dogon, is a tiny vortex, a tiny spiral. Now, the parallel to that from a universal perspective, from a macrocosmic perspective, is also a spiral. And the Dogon were saying that there's an example of this spiral that's within our view if we want to look at it, if we want to see it, if we understand that it's there. And they give some clues as to how to find it. And when you follow those clues, what it leads you to is a spiraling birthplace of stars whose light is so faint that we can't even image it without time-lapse photography. It's called Barnard's Loop, and it centers on the belt stars of Orion, and it's a spiral, just as the Dogon describe it. The structure actually has all of the attributes that the Dogon described for this tiny structure of matter. So the fact that they knew that it was there, that's one. I take that as one of the signatures of this tradition. If you find any culture in the world who talks about a wheel or a spiral associated with Orion, or if they talk, the Dogon call it the chariot of Orion because when it's imaged, it looks like the wheel of the chariot that Orion the Hunter is standing in. And so any culture that says there's a chariot associated symbolically with Orion, you know automatically is connected to the same tradition. That's too random a thing to associate without having it come out of the same tradition.
Mm-hmm.
So how do they tie that into biological reproduction?
Well, the structures are, the processes as they see them are parallel. For example, biological reproduction begins with the formation of an egg. And so mythically, the concept of the origin of the universe begins with a cosmogonic egg.
Mm-hmm.
And when we talk about the formation of matter, it begins with a figure that looks like the Egyptian sun glyph, a circle with a dot that's called the egg and the ball. So we have the symbol of an egg having related meanings in all three themes. And as you move up the scale, every symbol that we talk about, when we ask what its meaning is, we really have to say meaning in relation to which of those themes, because there's variation. If we're talking about the symbol of a hemisphere, if we're talking about biological reproduction, it represents the womb.
Mm-hmm.
If we're talking about the formation of matter, it represents the expansion of mass. And each of these symbols, all the way up and down the scale, and the Egyptians based their language on this, their written language on these symbols. There are probably 4,000 Egyptian glyphs, and many of those have meaning in terms of these three creative themes.
Well, Nassim Haramein said that everything has the vortex of singularity within, so, part of the reproduction process is bringing in a soul from higher dimensions, fourth dimension down to third dimensional physicality, so perhaps that's correlating, the egg, the womb, and that process of bringing spirit or other essences into form, that type of thing.
Yes, it's there's parallelism in terms of the concept of bringing binding life force to material forms.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. What you have to ask? Okay, so you tied all that in. So this is kind of pointing in my mind that there's a global society, information exchange, or someone that's traveling through time and to different cultures. So let's see, went to Egypt, Tibet, China, Turkey, and northern Scotland. So take us on a journey. What happened next?
Well, historically, what it looks like happened
Mm-hmm.
what it looks like happened is that at 10,000 BC, there was a deliberate instructional effort that happened in Turkey. Turkey is sort of centrally located to the continent, and there's a site in southern Turkey called Göbekli Tepe where a lot of the physical aspects we see at this site, standing stones and pillars and carved figures of animals and things like that, have meaning in terms of later traditions that came out of that. And one of my books called Point of Origin, I use language and other references to trace what we see at that site in Turkey down through India and into Egypt in the south at around 4000 BC at Elephantine. There seems to be another thread directly from Göbekli Tepe to Egypt at 10,000 BC. I don't know if you're familiar with Robert Bauval's theory that the three large pyramids at Giza represent the belt stars of Orion.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
the Sphinx faces Leo in the era of 10,000 BC. Now, these alignments are made at the period of 10,000 BC. And so from my point of view, there are really only two possibilities here. Either there was a direct influence at 10,000 BC in Egypt, and those alignments were made at that time, or else somewhere later on down the line, somebody had the capability of retrospectively calculating the proper alignment, which I don't think is as credible.
Right. It's more logical that it was actually at 10,000.
Right. So it looks to me as if there was an initial attempt to establish agriculturally based society in Egypt at 10,000 BC that ended up not succeeding.
Well, weren't they once known as the breadbasket for their whole society at one point?
They were, but not until a later period of time. The agriculturally based kingship that survived in Egypt was established around 3000 BC or maybe 3100 BC, and this earlier attempt would have been 7,000 years earlier than that.
So when was the flood in your cosmology, the Great Flood?
So the likeliest point would have been at the point where the Ice Age ended. One way an Ice Age can end is with a change in the tilt of the axis of the planet. And if that happened, we'd see ice caps melt very suddenly, and there would be raising sea levels everywhere and global flooding. That a number of the cultures, including Egypt, talk about changes in the orientation of the planet. The Egyptians say that 3 times in their cultural memory, the sun rose where it formerly set.
Mm-hmm.
We can see physical effects on the planet that support that idea. I'll give you an example. Around 700 BC, there were some major geological event happened to the planet that we can see the effects of. There was major fluctuation in the electromagnetic field of the planet. Cultures all around the world suddenly abandoned their 360-day year that they had observed for thousands of years and adopted a 365-day year, as if there had been a physical change in the length of the year. Crops that had been formerly cultivated in China for thousands of years suddenly couldn't be grown there anymore. There was climate change. There's a situation where, with eclipses, if you imagine that the motions of the Earth and the Sun and the Moon are regular like clockwork, then we should be able to use a computer to calculate backwards and verify the dates and the places of all these total eclipses of the Sun.
Right.
And that's true to a point. It's true until 709 BC. And suddenly at 709 BC, if you go earlier than that, the eclipses can't be verified any longer. They can verify everyone after 709 BC, but in places like China, there are upwards of 40 reports of eclipses that they can't verify mathematically.
Wow.
There was a change in the ion absorption rate of plants at that same point in time, so that radiometric dating doesn't work smoothly across that boundary. They have to fudge values to be able to get radiometric dating to work.
So you're saying, let me back up a little bit. So the Noah's flood was about what year? And then we're going to 700.
Well, if we imagine that
BC.
Noah's flood happened at the end of the Ice Age, that would be sometime in the neighborhood of 11,000 BC.
11,000 BC, okay. And then you're saying something else happened at 709 BC.
Yeah,
was
there
it
are
the same thing?
Other major events that occur. One happens around 1500 BC when the huge eruption of the volcano at A.R.E. happens, and that puts an immediate end to the Minoan Empire, and it's the boundary between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, I think, or the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom in Egypt. That event is also associated with major fluctuation in the magnetic field that nobody can explain why it happened. And we see effects, more tangible effects. You've got primordial forests, petrified forests in Antarctica of the size that Lewis and Clark found on the west coast of the U.S. in the 1850s. And you shouldn't be able to grow a forest like that with the amount of sunlight you've got at the South Pole. No matter, even if the climate were warmer, the fluctuation of sunlight is such that you shouldn't be able to grow trees that big down there.
Right.
And so it looks as if Antarctica wasn't always positioned where it is right now. At one time, it might have been positioned in a different place. And change in the tilt of the axis of the planet might happen without absolutely catastrophic effects to everyone living on the planet. There would be big effects, but might not destroy everything. It's not as if you were changing the direction that it was rotating. You're really only like rolling a ball forward. Even if you had a spinning ball, you could change the tilt of it without having a lot of effect.
So are there any other periods? We have 10,000 BC, 1500 BC, 709 BC. Any other periods, and is there a pattern of any kind that you're detecting?
Not a regular pattern, no. And part of this gets into a controversial book. I wrote a book about Immanuel Velikovsky, who was a colleague of Einstein's. He wrote a book called Worlds in Collision back in 1950 that made the heretical claim that Venus wasn't billions of years old, but only a few thousand years old, and that Venus had made close approaches to the Earth and had been responsible for some of these unusual circumstances. That's its own whole set of questions and issues. But there's
So
all
what do you
sorts
think of Velikovsky's theories? Personally, what do you think?
I approached the book. I thought that after 60 years after he had written, that we ought to have enough science to be able to find some fact that would tip that controversy either against him or in favor of him. And instead what I found was that at every stage of his scenario, there are half a dozen considerations that, if he's wrong, require special explanation by the scientist. And if he's right, evaporate. Now, as a student of science myself, I was taught by my teachers that that's the hallmark of a theory that's probably right, not one that's wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So my best guess is that it looks to me like that Velikovsky's scenario is a reasonable one, looking at it at every stage of it and asking the questions of how could this possibly be, or could this possibly be. There are fairly reasonable explanations for each section of it. I don't agree with some of he tries to give qualitative proofs of chemical interactions and things like that, and I don't think that that's really a legitimate way to explain chemical processes. So that piece of it I wouldn't try to endorse. But the idea that Venus was not originally in its orbit during historical times makes some sense. We have drawings and records that Ptolemy kept at around 100, or around the time, the BC AD boundary, and we have records that Copernicus kept, similar records, records of the visibility of Venus and drawings of the phases of Venus that he kept around 1500 AD, and neither of those records agrees with what we see now for Venus, and they don't agree with each other either. So it looks as if Venus's motions were in flux during that period of time.
So we just heard a theory, and I don't really claim that I master it, that the Saturn was once a second sun, and then we have Sitchin's theories about Nemesis and Nibiru, etc., and the brown dwarf. So have you compared all these different ideas?
I haven't. My starting point has not really been other researchers for the most part. It's been the cultures that I'm looking at it. So when I make an interpretation, I really want that interpretation to start with a clear statement on the part of the culture I'm studying, and then try to prove or disprove the thing they're saying. So it doesn't boil down to that Laird-Scranton says this is true. It's the Dogon who are claiming that their symbols represent matter. All I'm doing is testing it, laying it side by side with what we know to be true about science, and say, could they be right about this?
Are there cultures that correlate Velikovsky's information about Venus, besides Copernicus and
actually, yes,
Ptolemy?
Our culture does. Our modern culture does. The scientists, the astronomers who have been spending time in recent years studying the exosolar systems, the solar systems that are outside of our own, they've come around to a point of perspective on how planets form that is almost a perfect match for what Velikovsky said happens. They endorse that for exosolar systems. But the astronomers who are focused on our solar system aren't ready to endorse that yet. And so, yes, there are cultures that agree with Velikovsky, but the one that agrees most of them is our own set of scientists who look at these other solar systems.
Now, do any of your cultures you're studying look at or correlate with Sitchin's information about how the solar system was created and Nibiru coming through approximately every 3,600, give or take, couple of years?
Not specifically. And I haven't spent time studying the Sumerian traditions as much as he has. My approach to other researchers' theories reminds me of the game of Clue, if you ever played it. The game where you're holding a hand of cards and someone makes a theory. They say, Colonel Mustard committed the murder in the library with the candlestick. And I look at my hand and I say, now, is there anything in my hand that precludes that? If it does, I show the card. And if I don't, then I allow the possibility that the theory might be right. And Sitchin sort of is in that category for me, that I haven't studied his sources closely enough to be able to render an opinion as to whether he might be right or might not, or might be wrong about it.
Yeah. Okay. So we've been studying Sitchin. I'm just curious. It's wondering what's going on with others researchers, because it's something we all sit down and correlate.
It's fairly clear that there's another planet out there that has been influencing the orbits of bodies out there. I mean, there's enough scientific evidence right now to show that there are perturbations in these orbits that imply that there's something there that we haven't noticed.
What about the moon? Is there any indications that the moon was pulled in later, or it's artificial, or there's a lot of stories about the moon.
Yeah, and that's also hard to sort out the truth from the fable. There are two traditional theories of how the moon formed. One involves an impact, and another one involves the close approach of a body that would have drawn off material from the Earth. And oddly enough, that theory, which is endorsed for the formation of the moon, is almost exactly what Velikovsky's theory was, which they didn't endorse for the formation of Venus. And one of the principles in astronomy is that any process that can happen on a small scale can also happen on a larger scale. So it seems inconsistent to me that they could be endorsing one in one case and then denying the other in the other case, but that's just the way modern science seems to be framed.
Okay, so how, in terms of the people that have studied the exoplanet formation, what is the leading theory that would account for Velikovsky's conclusions?
Okay,
how do planets form?
From what they see with these solar systems they've studied, gassy planets, gas giant planets, form in the first 10 million years after a star is formed, and that the rocky planets then form in the next 10 million years, largely because of collisions that happen with the gas giants. They're related to the gas giants. And that's basically what Velikovsky says, that Venus was the product of a collision. Now, if that's true, then there's no requirement for a planet to be formed billions of years ago. We could have one formed tomorrow if the right circumstance happened. So the exo-astronomers are basically saying that from their perspective, I mean, they've seen planets in these exosolar systems that have comets' tails, just like Velikovsky describes for Venus, and whose behavior is very much like Velikovsky says Venus's was. So it's not as if we don't have real examples of what Velikovsky is saying. It's just that one set of astronomers aren't endorsing what the other set of astronomers are.
So what about the asteroid belt? Was that a planet that was destroyed in some kind of collision or war, or what's your thoughts on the asteroid belt?
It looks like it could be, but there are also, like some of the protoplanets, if you believe that a very small protoplanet was formed billions of years ago, it's almost impossible to think that it still has a hot core. And they come up, they say, well, there are radiation effects that are keeping it hot, or even though it's so far out there that it gets a fraction of the sunlight the Earth does, that somehow that fraction of sunlight is warming it enough to keep it, keep liquid water below the frozen surface, or to cause changes in temperature they can detect that are, as you go deeper in the planet, that is still warm, actively heated from the inside. So in those cases, I don't see any reason why those might not have also been the product of the same collision that Velikovsky talks about. Carl Sagan was the one who said that any collision process like that produces a large body will also produce many smaller bodies. And so I think that a lot of the short-term comets whose orbits gravitate towards Jupiter on one end and the Sun on the other end, that it may not be because they were captured by Jupiter, it may be because they originated there.
Any questions, Sash? Okay, so continue on the journey you're taking us and the listeners on with your research.
So we start
We'll
with influences at 10,000 BC. We can see in Egypt that there may have been direct influences in that era. We can also see that those influences passed, DNA and language studies and studies of how certain civilizing skills spread, like animal husbandry and things like that. They gravitate out of that Fertile Crescent region in all directions. They go towards Asia, they go towards Europe, they go down through India, they go as far south and east as Australia, they go into Africa. So we can trace those things. It's reasonable to think that here in the Fertile Crescent, where we see the first evidence of cultivated grains, of metallurgy, of animal husbandry, of stone masonry, that could have been a center of instruction, because it's the same set of skills that the Dogon are saying were taught to them that we see appearing all at one moment in the same spot in the Fertile Crescent. So,
right.
So there are influences that look like they passed down from that 10,000 BC era down through India that predate the Vedic tradition and the Buddhist and the Hindu tradition, and that end up down in entering into Egypt at Elephantine around 4000 BC and provide one set of influences in Egypt. We have some competing sets of influences in Egypt that make it hard to sort things out. Some of them are 10,000 BC era influences, some are 4000 BC era influences. It looks as if by 3200 BC, there was a second instructional center organized on Orkney Island in northern Scotland. This is a question I was asked to research by an acquaintance, whether there could have been Egyptian influences in northern Scotland at 3200 BC. What I found when I started to look at it was that the architecture of all of the original houses that were built in this site at A.R.E. at 3200 BC are a structural match for a type of stone house the Dogon tribe built. From my perspective, the Dogon were Egyptian at 3200 BC.
So if you look at the Sumerian stories, they talk about bringing agriculture into the earth and setting up schools and instructing people, and then Enki apparently went up to the island, Scotland, and took his teachings there because of some kind of what was the Sodom and Gomorrah? What year was that?
That was 2025 BCE.
What happened in 4000? That was the creation of Sumeria, of Sumer?
No, that was the Sumerian civilization in the Sitch's material. He reckons it around. It was first after the flood of 11,000 BCE. First, they Ninurta and Enki redug out the mud and got the Tigris and Euphrates going, and then they moved their attention to Egypt. And they built the Great Pyramid as a marker to where the new Sinai spaceport would be, because the Sipar had been wiped out in mud. They've got an elaborate story in the Sumerian texts about how all this came about and when it came about, which is it seems to be much earlier than the kind of stories that you're relating to these tribes.
Okay. All right, so 3200, the Orkney Island in northern Scotland has the same structural match as the Dogon.
As the Dogon house, but the interesting thing is that the Dogon house, the plan has cosmology to it, cosmological symbolism to it. The house represents the body of a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess. There's a round room that represents her head, and a central room that's her body cavity, and side rooms that are her arms, and so forth. Well, the A.R.E. house, that all of the original houses in this little village were built to the same plan, is a match for that Dogon house that has cosmology associated with it. Now, near that village in northern Scotland, there are a series of megalithic sites laid out. They were connected by a road in Neolithic times, laid out in a rough form of a spiral that leads to the Scarborough village. And each of those sites presents a form that is one of the recognized stages of this process of creation that Dogon described. So the cosmology not only explains the house form, but it also explains these other megalithic forms that are nearby. You also have direct connections between one of the languages, the ancient languages in northern Scotland is called Faroese language, and the Dogon language and the Egyptian languages. So that place names on Orkney Island that have no known Scandinavian roots, you can explain why the place was called what it was called based on looking at Dogon and Egyptian words.
All right, we're at the top of the hour, so let's hold that thought, and we'll be back right after this break. And you're listening to The Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio.
Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message. The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and freedomslips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
Enter into a world unseen on Raven Star's Witching Hour. You will encounter eclectic topics from the realm of spirit brought into our matrix of truth. With your host, the Solaris Blue Raven. Solaris will bring you an array of unique guests covering topics from ghostly spirits to amazing anomalies, covert technology, UFOs, and shadowy global events.
And that's right here, Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, Saturdays, midnight till 2 a.m. Eastern Time. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
Let the magic rise.
This is the people's war. It is our war. We are the fighters. Fight it then. Fight it with all that is in us. And may God defend the right.
Warning, warning.
We've got to stop them! They're going to kill us all! See how the trouble you've started? Be they the government, be they industry, be they organized labor, be they anyone, or human beings. Time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all.
Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, the #1 listener-supported talk radio station, throwing ourselves upon the gears of the machine. Revolution Radio, where information never sleeps.
You called down the thunder, well now you got it. Right, you tell them I'm coming, and hell's coming with me, you hear? Hell's coming with me!
Revolution Radio.
feel that things were not quite right? That everything was just ever so slightly askew?
Do you have, to paraphrase Morpheus, a splinter in your mind?
If you're interested in hearing the latest information about UFOs, the paranormal,
ancient cultures and structures,
monatomic elements,
longevity,
fantastic discoveries in science,
downloaded to your brain,
then tune into us. Hi, I'm Dave.
And I'm Mackie.
And we are Shiny Side Out, Sundays 2 to 4 a.m. Eastern. See you then.
Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com. You don't need to expect us. We're already here.
Enjoy your extra big-ass fries.
You didn't give me no fries. I got an empty box.
Would you like another?
Extra big-ass fries.
I said I didn't get any.
Thank you. Your account has been charged. Your balance is 0. Please come back when you can afford to make a purchase.
No.
I'm sorry you're having
trouble.
trouble.
Come on. My kids are starving.
Thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio. Here at Revolution Radio, we believe in freedom of ideas, freedom of speech, but above all, we believe in freedom of existence through self-reliance. This station is 100% listener-supported, and as a fundraising promotion, I have a kick-ass free gift for a $100 donation. 35,000 seeds. 25 years in the freezer. Long-term storable, 54 different varieties. So if food prices go crazy, the shit hits the fan, or if you just want to save tons of money every year by creating your own food like I do, grab our Seed Pack Special. Just look for the banner on the homepage at freedomslips.com. Don't be a statistic. Don't be part of the problem. Be part of the solution. We need, as humans, to start taking care of ourselves and not depending on the megacorps to provide unhealthy, nasty food. Included in this package is also a DVD with 900 survival and off-grid living documents and the offline home canning how to do everything website all on the DVD. So when you're growing all that food, you know how to can it, store it, preserve it, etc. with all these documents. So thank you for tuning in to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. I hope that you will pick up this package and start learning to be free. Revolution Radio, freedomslips.com, where information never sleeps and freedom is one seed that needs to be planted.
What we do in life, it goes in eternity.
And now a holiday message to our favorite people in all the world, our listeners. Revolution Radio is you. Now, thanks to your continuing support, Revolution Radio will embark on its 6th year, bigger and better than ever. You, the listeners, have made Revolution Radio what it is, the #1 commercial-free, listener-supported talk radio station on the web and in the world. With 24 hours of live programming, 92 hosts on 2 astounding networks, Studio A and Studio B, delivering directly to you the most cutting-edge information available. In fact, you, the listeners, have gone on to be some of our most popular radio hosts. You, the listener, offer feedback that molds our programming to appeal to our worldwide audience. In fact, you, the listener, provide us with eyes and ears on the ground to give us the inside scoop on stories the mainstream media fears to touch, reporting about newsworthy events in your area, and you, the listener, are the lifeblood of this station. And we thank you for being such a treasured member of our Revolution Radio family. And so this holiday season, from all of us to all of you, have a happy and safe holiday season, and let's make this new year a success once again together. Thank you.
The opinions expressed on this radio station, its programs, and its website by the hosts, guests, and call-in listeners or chatters are solely the opinions of the original source who expressed them. They do not necessarily represent the opinions of Revolution Radio and FreedomSlips.com, its staff, or affiliates. You're listening to Revolution Radio, FreedomSlips.com, 100% listener-supported radio, and now we return you to your host.
And welcome back to the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com. And I am Janet Kerr Lessin with Dr. Sasha Lessin and author-researcher Laird-Scranton. Before we get back to our show, I'd like to remind everybody to please go over to our donation button on freedomslips.com and donate whatever you can, $1, $5, $10, $15, $20, $100 would be greatly appreciated. We do thank you very much for your donation. And Thomas Becker, a mad painter, are there any specials this week?
No, ma'am. We are raising money for the Standing Rock protest, and if you want to contribute to that, you just put that in the tagline down there on Skype or on PayPal, and it'll get to them.
Excellent. Good cause. Saj, before we get back to Laird.
Okay, so what we're doing is we're tracking Laird's studies and sequence of various cultures and where they've led you in terms of as this unfolds. And I hope in this hour that we get into what happened in China, because I don't know much about China.
All right, so continue your journey with taking us around the planet through history.
Okay. Well, in talking about northern Scotland, we had connections that were architectural between northern Scotland and the Dogon, and those pointed us towards a system of cosmology to explain why certain structures were certain ways. But it also pointed us to a set of languages, and by comparing to the Dogon and the Egyptian languages, we're able to now suddenly explain place names all around northern Scotland that didn't have Scandinavian roots, that we could go to a site and interpret why it was called, what it was called, based on the structure that's there, based on where it was located, how it was situated, that the Dogon and the Egyptian words made it clear why the site was called what it was. So it looks like agriculture was being instructed on Orkney Island at around 3200 BC. Shortly thereafter, we have, at around 3100 BC, we see appear in four corners of the world agriculturally based kingships associated with lions or with large lion-like cats. We have one in Egypt whose ancient name was arguably Taru. We have one in Ireland named Aru, one in China named Iru, and one in South America called Peru.
Oh, wow.
Oh, my gosh.
Now, those terms have other interesting meanings. They can be interpreted on one level of understanding to represent the four cardinal points of the planet. One refers to sunrise, another to sunset, one to upper and one to lower. They also can be taken on another level to represent four stages of agriculture. One represents an uncultivated field, one represents a field that's been planted, a third one represents a field with crops growing, and the fourth one represents a granary where harvested grain is stored.
What does Ru mean? Have you decided what the word R-U
Ru is
means?
an Egyptian word that means lion. It's
lion.
That applies to the Sphinx. And from a symbolic standpoint, an image of the front part of a lion with its two paws can represent the concept of the foremost part of something, like the beginning of something. Mm-hmm. Clearly, a lion is an animal that's associated with kingship in a lot of cultures in the world. So there's symbolism there also. Now, to take us into China, 3000 BC, just after that period of time, is when written language appears in all these various cultures. Interestingly, in my experience, the cultures that did the best job of maintaining these systems of symbols are the ones who never adopted a written language. The Dogon don't have one. The symbolism itself, with the sort of mnemonic effects that symbolism has to reinforce its meanings, it was really actually a more effective and powerful way to convey this information from generation to generation than writing it down and having somebody. There's something about writing it down that absolves a person from having to know and be on top of the information. Once you've written it down, you can sort of let it go and forget about it. To bring this into China, the references we have in China begin at around 3000 BC. But the difficulty is that we only know about those 3000 BC era references based on texts that were written around 300 BC. So you have this huge gap of knowledge in China that opens up debate among academics, active arguments about every little point, because there's no way to firmly establish what was meant by a certain reference or a certain symbol or whatever, because you don't have the kinds of evidence that survived in Egypt. In my book, because I see that there is commonality of language that goes back to these cultures, and I can demonstrate this commonality of language, I use Dogon and Egyptian dictionaries to explain what ancient Chinese terms probably meant. Now, to give you an example of why that's a legitimate process, in ancient Egypt, there's a very simple word, a two-glyph word. It means week, as in days of the week. And in Egypt, it's written with two glyphs. It's the sun glyph, which is a circle with a dot that can represent the sun or can represent the concept of a day. And the second glyph is an upside-down U that is the Egyptian number 10. I looked at that word, and I said, symbolically, the word to me says 10 days. And so I did some research, and I discovered that the Egyptians had a 10-day week in ancient times.
Wow.
So I was astonished to see that the glyphs of the word conveyed factual information to me about what the word meant that I didn't know before I went to research it. When you go to ancient China, their ancient word, hieroglyphic word for week, is written with two glyphs also. It's the Chinese sun glyph, which started out round with a dot like the Egyptian glyph, and the Chinese number 10, and they also had a 10-day week. So these written languages at some point in history look as if they were formed from the same model, based on the same model. They worked the same way, that the way that I read Egyptian hieroglyphs, which is by substituting concepts for symbols, is the way that ancient Chinese glyphs are traditionally read. So there's a basis for thinking that this might be a legitimate way to read them.
Excellent.
Now,
go ahead. Go ahead, and then I have a question about kings.
Go ahead and ask the question.
You said that they had the four quarters represented kingships. So when did we get the idea of kings? Was this the origins of the idea of kings? And are there any references to who those four kings are?
Well, I'm using the term kingship in sort of as a generic term, and it probably isn't proper because at that point in time it was probably queens. In ancient Egypt, far down the line in the pharaohs, the assignment of who's in charge of the culture, the right to rule passed to the women, not the men. And the men only had it by association with the women. So the man became pharaoh by being married to the woman who the lineage passed through. It's as in Judaism, you're Jewish if your mom's Jewish, and what your dad is doesn't really pertain in the same way because you know for certain who the mother is.
Uh-huh.
So in ancient times, at 10,000 BC, we're talking about matriarchal traditions that, as part of a cross-cultural set of reversals that happen sometime after 5,000 BC, you see things change over. I mean, in Egypt, by 2600 BC, you start seeing gods being prominent where goddesses had been prominent before that. And you see other reversals in symbolism that happen, as I said, cross-culturally. So when I say kingship, I really mean civilizations founded on agriculture. where there was a central government of some kind. In the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, the word queen is actually a word that's transliterated as Qen, that essentially means queen. Lots of signs that it was a matriarchal tradition originally. Isis and Nephthys were influential early on, and it was only later that Osiris and Horus and Egyptian gods take precedent.
Fascinating. Okay. Any questions? Okay, continue, please.
Okay, now,
I'm sorry.
So we have
Go ahead.
now an important aspect of the Egyptian language is we can see that we can read these words by substituting concepts for glyphs. And we know what certain glyphs mean because the Dogon have the same shape and the same meaning assigned to certain shapes, cosmological drawings, that eventually appeared in these hieroglyphic languages. It's as if these predefined shapes were adopted as written characters when written language came along. But in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, there's a particular type of word that also includes a trailing glyph that doesn't get pronounced. Now, from the standpoint of traditional Egyptologists, they think that these glyphs are there for emphasis because the glyph usually has something to do with the meaning of the word. If they're talking about a table, final unpronounced glyph might be a picture of a table. From my standpoint, I can tell that the symbolic sentence you create when you substitute concepts for glyphs produces a sentence that defines that trailing glyph. This is a definition. And so, based on that outlook, you're able to develop a long list of hundreds of Egyptian glyphs whose meanings rest on the symbolic definitions of the language itself, not on what the Dogon say is true or what I infer to be true. And once you have that, then you're in a position to pretty much read any Egyptian word you want to. And when you have cross-comparability to other cultures like Buddhism and the Dogon culture and so forth, when I start with a new concept, I go to the Egyptian words and see what the symbols tell me. And then I firm that up by comparing to what the other cultures have to say about the same concept. Are the symbols really telling me something that's correct? And what I find is I can rely on that. In one of my books, I was trying to come up with a definition, a succinct definition for what a symbol is. And I had made several tries at it, writing out paragraphs or pages of trying to get to a definition of what a symbol, what the concept of a symbol represents. And it finally occurred to me that I had it right in front of me. I could go to the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary and find the two words that they have for symbol, and those the glyphs that wrote the words would give me the definition I was looking for. One of them says, action preserves knowledge, and the other one says, action replicates knowledge.
Wow.
One of the words is pronounced Hashem, like Hashem in Hebrew, which is a word that's substituted for in place of the name of God in written. You are not supposed to speak the name of God or write the name of God, and so there are these words that act as symbols for the name of God, essentially. Another one is Aduno, which is like a Hebrew word Adonai, which works in the same way. It's a placeholder for the name of God. So, realizing this, the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary becomes basically an encyclopedia. That I can go to it and I can sort out the essentials of a concept I don't understand by looking at the Egyptian words that relate to it. Now, because of connections like that word for week, where the Chinese word is formulated in exactly the same way that the Egyptian one is, I'm now in a position to argue that other Chinese terms that are not very well understood by the scholars in China relate to the Dogon and Egyptian words that are much better explained, much better explicated. And so in the book, I basically step through all sorts of different ancient concepts of China and try to clarify what the Chinese were talking about by looking to what the Dogon, the Egyptians, and the Buddhists have to say about the same concept. There's a plan for architecture in China that was considered to be theoretic. It's called the Wellfield plan. And the idea is that you would create 9 plots of land, 9 square plots of land that fit together like a larger square. and the central plot becomes a well that's shared by the families who work the other 8 plots. Well, that system of agriculture in China is considered to be purely theoretic, even though there are examples of it actually having been implemented. But when you go to the Dogon culture, that's the way they do things. That's how agriculture works for them. This is not a theoretic plan. It's an actual working plan. And so to be able to compare back and forth and compare the terms that define it back and forth, you gain a lot of insight into what the Chinese were really talking about.
So who do you think was spreading this information? Was it a teacher going around, or how did it get from one part of the world to another?
I think that the mechanism was that students were brought to a central location and taught as if it were a school or a campus. On Orkney Island in Scotland, it has all of the appearance of a college campus. As a matter of fact, when I graduated from college, in the years following college, if someone had said, well, when you die, if you could go any place you wanted to, where would you go? My first answer, immediate answer would have been, I'll go back to college. College is the place where things were wonderful.
Oh, yeah.
Well, okay, so on Orkney Island in Scotland, you have a series of megalithic sites that lead to this cluster of 8 chambers at the village of Scarborough. And that cluster of 8 villages is one of the definitions of this fundamental structure of matter that can also be looked at as a spiral. It can be looked at a couple of different ways. But in the Dogon conception, that's only part of the way up the scale to where you get to atoms. There are other stages in between. And so when I hit that point, I thought, well, gee, I wonder if they were to find any of the other stages above that, beyond this cluster, this fundamental structure of matter. Well, the next stage of creation, from a scientific point of view, is the formation of fundamental particles, which, in the eyes of astronomers, astrophysicists, fundamental particles form against the backdrop of what's called a background field. For the Dogon, the way they represent that, these particles are the product of vibrations. And so what the Dogon do to represent that is, every year when they're about to start planting seeds, they go to the field, the actual physical agricultural field of their top priest, who's called the A.R.E priest, and they draw a figure in his field. It's sort of like a crop circle. It's a circle with a bunch of zigzag lines in it that represent vibrations of matter, different vibrations of matter. So, knowing that
Go ahead.
Knowing that the Dogon were Egyptian at 3200 BC, I shouldn't be talking about a Dogon concept. I should be talking about an Egyptian concept that relates to Scotland. And so I went to look, could the Egyptians have a concept that related to that field of the A.R.E priest? Mm-hmm. Well, the Egyptian word for field is seket. And it turns out there is a concept called seket A.R.E in Egypt. But seket A.R.E is a term that refers to a place called the Field of Reeds. The Field of Reeds is the Egyptian concept of heaven. It's what later became the Elysian Fields with the Greeks. Mm-hmm. This is a concept that just as the Dogon concept it represents a theoretic concept, but it also represents an actual physical real-world field. The same is true of the Egyptian concept of the Seket A.R.E and the Greek concept of the Elysian Fields. It was a theoretical heaven, but it was also an actual real-world locale that was being described. When the Pharaoh died, he was described in the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, as going far to the west to a place called the Seket A.R.E where he would work in agricultural fields very happily. Now, when you get to ancient Greece, they they give us descriptions of where the Elysian Fields are, and they talk about what it looks like. It's described as an island, very much like Orkney Island, situated just right where Orkney Island is situated, with all the attributes that Orkney Island had. In the Egyptian drawings where they show animals on the island that the Pharaoh was working the fields of, those animals are all indigenous to Orkney Island in Scotland.
My question is, how did it get from Egypt up to Scotland? Are there any stories of how that went there?
The Egyptians had ships that were very capable of traveling that distance. These were ocean-going ships. they've uncovered, some were buried next to the pyramid, they've uncovered that were perfectly capable of traveling that kind of a distance. But as from the standpoint of the teachers who were teaching this stuff, the fact that they know what they knew about science says to me they had no problems traveling wherever they wanted to travel.
Yeah.
Right. So they went, but did they go to any place in between? Are you seeing this information? That's a long distance from Egypt all the way up to Scotland. There's a lot of land.
Do you find it in the south of England? Do you find it in Ireland, so forth?
Right, that's what I'm asking.
And you do. You find artifacts, Egyptian artifacts, all the way up through there. Even up in Scotland, you find. Recently, there were some Egyptian artifacts found in the bottom of one of the nests in Scotland. There's lots of signs that there was contact here. It's just not traditional academics are not really talking about this.
All right. So then in your studies, you went from Egypt to Scotland, or did you go to other countries with your studies?
Conceptually, I started in Africa talking about the Dogon, which led me to comparisons to ancient Egypt and comparisons to the Egyptian language and things like that. Then the studies moved up to comparisons of Buddhism. There was a controversy. The Dogon had by some French anthropologists who described a closely held secret tradition there. This is the esoteric tradition. And there was argument about whether that was really a legitimate study or not. A Belgian anthropologist named Walter van Beek conducted a restudy of the Dogon. In 3 or 4 years, he restudied what had originally been studied in 30 years. And he concluded that the whole thing was fabricated, that the Dogon priest had simply made up a bunch of lies to tell this French anthropologist to satisfy his questions, and that the grand symbol of this cosmology, the granary structure that the Dogon had, was also a fabrication. This was something that he called it a chimera known only to the French anthropologist. In other words, this is just a concept he made up in his mind. It didn't really exist. What he missed was something my daughter picked up on, my daughter Hannah picked up on. She traveled in India for a few weeks when she was in college, and she came back and she said, by the way, when I was there, I saw these shrines all over India that reminded me of your Dogon shrine. And so I stopped her. I said, don't tell me anything more about it. I'm going to make some cold predictions here about what the symbolism of that shrine in India must be based on what I know of the Dogon. And we'll go online and we'll do some investigation and find out if those predictions are true. It turns out they all were. It's essentially a matching shrine attached to a matching cosmology. And so I wrote the Belgian anthropologist and I said, this can't be a fabrication because it links directly to something that's already accepted as a real thing. This is the shrine is a type of shrine that's known to cultures all across India and Asia. This isn't an imagined shrine; it's a real thing. And the cosmology that the French anthropologist says goes with the shrine is the same cosmology that goes with the Indian shrine. So this can't be a fabrication. I said, I would like to offer to co-report this new finding with you in the academic journal you edit. And we had an exchange of emails back and forth, but he never responded to that offer. And so I started looking for other academic journals and found one through the University of Chicago called Anthropology News that agreed to publish my article as long as I didn't make it an attack piece on the Belgian. They were happy to publish it. And so it's finding inferences like that where anyone can see that the situation must be the way that I'm describing it as being, and establishes as fact without actually having proof to 5 decimal positions that it's true.
So if you look at the Anunnaki Sumerian story, Inanna was given the Indus Valley, and so she was an Anunnaki, and she took this information over to India.
Okay,
just
now
another correlation.
Cosmologically, the term Nana is a Dogon name for the mother goddess who weaves matter. She's one of the central figures of the whole cosmology. So
there you go.
The problem that I have with each of these cultures is trying to separate statements that were made about what happens cosmologically from things that actually happened historically. And so when they say that the Mother Goddess does such and such, if that's a true statement about what the Mother Goddess is understood as doing as matter forms or as the universe forms, then chances are that that, at least on one level, is a cosmological statement, not an actual historical one. And so this is the trick. One of the tricks of trying to sort this stuff out is how can we prove that what the myth says happened is really not just a mask for the cosmology. In China, there's a good example of that. There are a set of mythical emperors in China who were responsible for bringing civilizing skills to the culture. Now, with each of these emperors, there are stories that have survived of what their name was and what they remember for having done, where they went in their life, what kinds of benefits they provided to China, and so on. The way the cosmology is configured, one of the benefits that helps me sort things out and to correlate things is that every term of the cosmology carries multiple meanings. Like the hidden god Amma, his name also means to grasp or to hold firm or to establish. And so when I go to Egypt and I find Amen, who's the hidden god, and his name also means to hold firm or to grasp, then I have a basis based on multiple points of correlating those two deities. When you go to Hebrew, I read an article that said that the Hebrew word Amen that follows at the end of a prayer can't relate to the Egyptian god Amen because the Hebrew word comes from a root that means to establish. Well, I read that article and I said to myself, the author doesn't have enough perspective on the cosmology to realize that he just shot himself in the foot. The fact that it's based on the word root to establish directly connects it to Amen. Okay, so this is the same thing with the myths. Okay, in China, with these emperors, when you take these terms that refer to what they did and where they went and what they're remembered for, and look those terms up in the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary, you find that they are all homonyms of one another. They're what, when you don't have a written language for the Dogon, play out as multiple meanings of a single word, but when you write them down with glyphs, look like homonyms. Words that are pronounced the same way but spelled differently.
How do you get from
a
glyph to a language that represents sounds? And I'm a little bit confused about that.
Okay, well, the Egyptian glyphs are traditionally thought of as being phonetic, primarily phonetic, like letters of English. Now, the easy disproof of that is that most languages are only trying to represent about 40 phonetic sounds, but you've got 4,000 Egyptian glyphs. It's not credible that you need 100 glyphs to represent each sound. So clearly there's something else going on besides phonetics here. Now, in China, so it's clear that these myths about these emperors are representing the multiple meanings of a cosmological term. And so from that standpoint, as a researcher, I have to see that as a convention of the cosmology, not as an actual historical description. Because you shouldn't have it be accidentally true that all of those attributes of that emperor play out as homonyms in the Egyptian dictionary of the same word. Okay, so the part of my problem in interpreting in any culture a statement that's given as if it's historical fact is there a way to distinguish whether it's fact or whether it's cosmology? Even the stories of the Exodus from Egypt play out that way, that the actions that Moses is said to take as he leaves Egypt and the things he does for the Israelites and so forth play out like multiple meanings of cosmological terms.
Yeah, you make a lot of sense to me. In the Sumerian creation myths, the planets are anthropomorphized, and there's a story about what Marduk does and so forth. And when you get down to historical accounts of a man called Marduk doing this and that and the other thing, and it's very easy to get them all confounded.
Yeah, it is. So that's one of the tricks is how do you sort that stuff out? So in China, I end up using Dogon and Egyptian references to try to get a better understanding of what happened cosmologically in China. But you can see other ramifications of those, like Chinese and Asian cosmological systems. You've got a Mongolian yurt, a Siberian yurt or a Mongolian yurt that takes 4 different forms. One of those forms is a structural and symbolic match for a Navajo roundhouse. This is a form of a stupa. It has the same symbolism as a Buddhist stupa. But you can argue that the Navajo have to be connected to the same cosmological system as I've been researching because of this relationship between the yurt forms. There's a second type of yurt that is more portable than that. It's formed from 3 or 4 poles that are put together and covered with skins. It's called a teepee. Well, that's a Native American form also. So our architecture can make connections for us that even if we don't know what the migration pattern was, we can see they have the same architectural form with the same symbolism. This is the same system of cosmology.
Very interesting. So tell us what you learned about China.
Okay, so a number of things. Taoism in China is pretty much a direct representation of the same stages of creation the Dogon talk about. And we can use the Chinese words, interpret them against Egyptian and Dogon words, and show that each of these stages that are compared to counting forward from 1 to 8 or 10 is representative of the appropriate stage of creation that the Dogon describe. And the phonetic value is a phonetic value that means the right number in the Egyptian language. The I Ching, the way that terminology of this cosmology works is it begins with simple phonetic values that we would see as 2 or 3 letter combinations, like Na is a symbol of feminism. That's why Na end up being the name of basically a grandmother goddess who's responsible for certain things in creation. Amma combines 2 phonemes. It's which is knowledge. From a biological perspective, that's knowledge in the biblical sense is procreation. Ma is an Egyptian word that means perception, which is the initiating stage of matter. An act of perception is what causes a wave to turn into a particle. So Amma's name is defined in relation to the initiating stage of creation biologically and in terms of matter. In China, the term I Ching or I Ching combines 2 phonemes. The first phoneme, I or Yi, refers to the concept of basically it's pivot. It's a complex notion of pivoting that happens. This is something that happens to waves after they've been perceived. Jing is a term that means vibration, and that complex combination of vibrating and pivoting is what creates the sort of helical shape that you think of when you see DNA, and it's a similar shape that gets created as matter forms. There are all sorts of different levels to interpret things on. The French anthropologists who studied the Dogon could see that all of the component attributes of a zodiac existed in the Dogon system. But he also knew that they didn't have an actual zodiac. Those didn't get put together into an actual zodiac until about 700 BC. And the Dogon system represents a form that looks like it comes from around 3000 BC. The animal forms in the Chinese zodiac, I could show by comparison to Egyptian words that each animal represented one of these progressive stages of creation also. Same is true of Göbekli Tepe. The animals we see pictured on the pillars there. The name of each animal in the Egyptian hieroglyphic dictionary is also a homonym for a term of cosmology. It's like this was a form of proto-writing where hunter-gatherer would see the picture of an animal that he knew the name of, and when he spoke the name of that animal, then he was also speaking the name of a term of cosmology that he might have been instructed about.
All right.
So China is an interesting case, and for me it was excellent practice because it was the first time I had to be able to try to find ways to do what I call anchoring an interpretation, but in the absence of written text to be able to anchor it against. I had to anchor it through inference of other sources. And Göbekli Tepe was another good example of that. I needed that practice to be able to sort out what was true for Göbekli Tepe because it precedes written language by thousands and thousands of years.
So then you went over to Tibet. Was it similar again, different?
Yes, in Tibet, there's a tribe from the borderland between Tibet and China called the Naki or the Naxi. Now, the Naki or Naxi are interesting because it's traditionally understood that they were black African originally. So much so that in China, the word Na ends up meaning black.
Mm-hmm.
They have a hieroglyphic written language that is still in existence. There's still a few people who know how to read it and write it, but very similar, like early forms of Egyptian hieroglyphs, very similar to some of the hieroglyphic languages of some African tribes. And so what I had done was, in one of my books, I lay out a list of what I consider to be signatures of this tradition. For example, I had talked about the spiral associated with Orion as a signature. You can't have that by accident. It has to be a part of this tradition. It can't be an accident that a culture uses cubits. If they do, they were part of the same tradition. If they have a hieroglyphic language that omitted vowel sounds, that's not an accident. That's a thing. So I laid out a whole set of what I consider to be these signature attributes of the tradition and used them to predict what I was going to find when I studied this Naki or Naxi tribe in Tibet and China. Part of what came out of that study was an understanding that there were, I talked about the naming conventions for the agricultural kingships, Taru, Aru, where the terms are the same in 4 different corners of the planet when they shouldn't be. Well, it's the same way with the tribes that had this cosmology. There was a naming convention for the tribes. That the North African tribes that the Dogon came out of were called the Amazighi. Ama is a word that refers to the tribal god, and Zighi is a form of an Egyptian word Sakai that means to celebrate. So the name of the tribes says celebrates Ama. The tribe name tells you it's as if they were majoring in a subject in college and they named themselves after it. I would name myself Studies English because I was an English teacher. Okay. So the Naki or Naxi, their name forms the same way. Na is the name of the mother goddess, and the Xi or Ki is another form of that Sakai that means to celebrate. In Egypt, the name was Mir Ra, means loves Ra. In Judaism, the name was Yahudah, means praises Yah. And you can find this naming convention. I mean, even in northern Scotland, Skara is located on a bay that's called the Bay of Skael. Ske is the same word for celebrate, Sakai, and El is a name for a god of space that's associated with the god of light, Yah, in Judaism.
Right, El means God, yeah. So
you can tell from the name, sometimes even just from the name of the tribe, that they must relate, because you can see that the phonetic values used to make up that name have cosmological meaning.
So it would be logical that, like in Taru, Aru, Eru, Peru, the T, A, E, and P, we think of it just as a letter, but it probably has a intrinsic meaning.
You're right, they do, and each of those phonetic values has an intrinsic meaning, to the point when I went to the Maori culture to study them, I realized that I could predict what a Maori word was going to mean based on the phonetics of it.
Okay, so tell us about that.
Okay, that's a book that hasn't even been submitted yet. It'll be once the A.R.E book is in publication. I'll submit the book about the Maori. The Maori connect in interesting ways to every other era that I've studied and every other culture I've studied so far. The Maoris are a much later group, but they were preceded. There are reports that they were preceded in New Zealand by a group of Pygmies.
Oh.
Okay, now the tradition, in northern Scotland, the A.R.E site and the sites nearby there were populated for about 600 years and then suddenly abandoned. And there are sort of symbolic messages that explain that it was abandoned under duress. They had to leave. And it looks like they moved south into Scotland and Ireland and England. Now in Ireland, the tradition eventually is that these Pygmies, who were the little people in Ireland, were forced out. And when they left, there are two myths. One myth says they left across the Western Sea. The other myth says they went to the underworld.
Oh,
now you go to New Zealand, and in New Zealand, their myth about the Pygmies in New Zealand was that they came to New Zealand from across the Eastern Sea, and the ancient name for New Zealand means for circle of the underworld.
Mm.
So the Maori book
what do they mean by the underworld?
Well,
does it mean under the earth? Does it mean
Agartha? Yeah.
Agartha? Does it mean hell, which was supposed to be South Africa? So that's under the world.
And
did you find
there are different levels to take the meaning on. This relates to concepts of above and below, which gets into concepts of ascension. It gets into these are also metaphors for material and non-material. But on one level of understanding, it's simply geographic. For the Egyptians, the term upper referred to the south, and lower referred to the north. Whereas from our perspective, north is upper and south is lower.
Mm-hmm.
Now, around sometime after 5000 BC, there are all these symbolic reversals. So, whereas formerly Scotland was considered to be the underworld, meaning it was in what was considered to be lower, in the later eras, that reverses, and what was lower now becomes upper, and what was formerly upper becomes lower. And now New Zealand, which is located in the southern hemisphere, is suddenly the underworld, whereas Scotland.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very, very interesting.
So who do you think these Pygmies are that are going around the whole planet?
Yeah, are they the same as the Hopi's ant people?
If somebody had came along to me and said, "Time's up. There's no more time here. You have to put down in writing what you think happened." It looks to me as if the way the system of how can I say this? The way that in the Dogon mindset there are two universes. The universes form in pairs, routinely form in pairs. Ours is the fourth of 7 pairs of universes. And those pairs include a non-material universe and a material universe that are like siblings to each other. And it looks to me as if at certain points in that relationship between those two universes, it becomes possible to cross over from one to the other, from the non-material side to the material side. The non-material side is described as having perfect knowledge, but an inability to act. And the material side is described as having imperfect knowledge and the full ability to act. Now, one way of understanding that is understanding how mass works. That Einstein says that as you accelerate something, or accelerating something is the equivalent of making it more massive, and that as you accelerate it or make it more massive, you slow its time frame down. Mm-hmm. That if you had astronauts traveling very close to the speed of light compared to us, that their time would pass much more slowly for them than it does for us, much more quickly for us. So now, if you imagine that the non-material world is virtually massless, it's wave-like, it must exist in an ultra-fast time frame compared to us. And so what the philosophies that underlie the Dogon system are saying is the non-material world has a perfect knowledge of everything because it's as if all events happen at once, but they have no ability to act because time frame is so quick, there's no moment to act in.
Mm-hmm.
On the material side, it's the opposite of that. We have imperfect knowledge, but we have every opportunity to act. And so in the mindset of this philosophy, there are routine attempts being made from the non-material side that communicate to the material side and to try to induce action on the material side. And these attempts take the form of very vivid images in dreams, or what look like coincidences or synchronicities. It includes things like odd behavior of animals, or it's reflected in clairvoyancy or in divination. And so part of what a person who is psychically connected does, or is spiritually connected does, is they've learned to pay attention to little subtle clues that your average person doesn't pay attention to. The average person just doesn't notice it.
Wow. That's neato. It explains a lot.
So in my estimation, it looks as if sometime in this process it became possible for non-material to cross over into the material. And now we're getting into an area of yet another book that's written but not submitted yet. There are, in my opinion, some really compelling motivations for the non-material side to need and want to orient the material side in a particular way, a particular outlook. And that's what the esoteric tradition is about. It's about trying to create a framework for society on the material side that orients us in a particular outlook.
Okay, and so let's say we bought it. What would it be like?
Well, it's everything you know about the esoteric tradition. It's trying to create a society where, the Dogon society and the Scarabray society were very peaceful societies, very non-judgmental and very peaceful. And one of the way peace was maintained is maintained in a Dogon village is through the use of something called a men's discussion house. It's called the Togun Na. And the idea is that if a conflict arises during the day in a Dogon village, anyone who has an interest in that conflict is required to go to the meeting house, and they're not allowed to leave until the conflict is resolved.
That's that's like the Hawaiian Ho'oponopono, yeah.
And that's sort of the mindset I came out of growing up in Oregon. It's very much the mindset that I encountered on Orkney Island and in areas nearby that. It's a very sort of a socialist with a small s outlook. It's there's a mindset in Oregon that is actively looking for the solution that works for everybody.
What happens if the women have a disagreement? Do they have a similar?
Yeah, that's right.
If the women had a disagreement, they would also have to do this. Any Dogon tribes person would have to do it. But more typically, if a disagreement happens, this is a matriarchal culture, and mostly the women are living fairly harmoniously.
Mm-hmm.
But still, I hear you saying archy, that is implying that there's uppers and lowers, hierarchy, and it seems like a lot of the problems of the world have to do with hierarchy, which disenfranchises the life force of people on the lower ends of the hierarchy. And that essentially is absent in Dogon society, if I get you right.
That's just a problem of language, not a real problem with the culture. In the culture, everybody's pretty much equal. Anybody can become an initiate, and they can become an insider to this esoteric tradition if they want to. The women are taught by the women, and the men are taught by the men. But the requirement is that the motivation has to come from the student. The student has got to be motivated to continue to ask the next pertinent question. And as long as they do, the elder is required to give them an honest answer to the question. But the caveat to that is that anyone who asks a question that's not appropriate to their status, their initiated status, the elder is required to remain silent or to even lie if they have to avoid revealing secrets.
Oh my gosh.
Actually, from my point of view, the esoteric tradition is structured as a grand symbol for the relationship between the two universes. It's the same thing, that the spiritually connected person who's paying attention to the answer and sincerely wants the answer, sincerely is seeking an answer, gets it. And the ones who aren't, don't.
Wow. Well, we're running out of time. I'm not sure exactly what time we end, but I'd like to give you a chance to promote yourself, and you have a number of books. Could you wrap up what we're saying?
My first principle about this information, these books, is that this is information that has no business being proprietary, and so I actively try to avoid overlaying a proprietary motivation on the top of them. The books are available pretty much anywhere. There's my publisher is Inner Traditions. There's a website called innertraditions.com, and they have a relationship with Simon & Schuster. So there's also a simonandschuster.com. I have author pages both places. But the books are available pretty much anywhere. You go to Amazon, you could typically find one or more of the books in stock at a Barnes & Noble or any bookstore you'd walk into, or you could certainly order a book through any of these bookstores. There's a Laird-Scranton.com website, but it's a fan site. The contact form reaches me. If someone wanted to send me a message, they could use that as a way to do it, or they can find me on Facebook and message me through Facebook. I'm pretty accessible, that way.
So if someone were to start researching this information, which book would you recommend for them to begin with?
It depends on how motivated they are about the information. If they're just looking for a quick way into it, I would suggest they start with a book called The Cosmological Origins of Myth and Symbol. It's the third book in the series, and it pretty much summarizes concepts in the first two books. If they're looking to really understand the foundation of the material, then they need to start at the beginning and work their way through the books in sequence. And the books do build in sequence. There's a problem that authors like I have in that as you build a series of books, and you're starting on the fifth book in the series, do I now spend 3/4 of this book rehashing what I already said in the previous 4 books? Or what do I do to convey to the person who's reading it all the things they might not know if they haven't read the other books?
And that's the dilemma of an author. Well, thank you so much, Laird.
Well, thank you very much for having me.
It's been a fascinating 2 hours. Much love and blessings of aloha. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. Thank you, Laird. This has been the Sacred Matrix on Revolution Radio.
Listen to Revolution Radio at freedomslips.com, and we'll be right back after this message.
Who owns you? If you're not in control, then someone else is. Join me, Ivy West, for Voices on the Wind, Saturday from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern in Studio A. I discuss government, health, metaphysics, suppressed science, universal mysteries, little-known incredible facts, alternative energies, and even more than you can imagine. Won't you join us on Revolution Radio Saturdays from 4 to 6 p.m. Eastern for Voices on the Wind with me, Ivy West.
There are lives in the balance, people under fire, children at the cannons.
Because if your head's in the sand, your tail is a target.